All right, strap yourselves in, folks, because today's deep dive is taking us straight into the eye of the storm. We're talking about Donald Trump's proposal for Gaza.
Yeah, a plan that's definitely making waves, to say the least.
Oh, absolutely. It's got people talking, debating, arguing, you name it. We've got a mountain of material to sift through today. News articles, opinions from all over the map, and even social media has gone completely bonkers.
Well, that's social media for you, right? Always a reliable source of perspective.
You said it. But our goal today is to cut through the noise, go beyond those snappy headlines, and really figure out what this proposal means. What are the potential consequences? And why should anyone even care, if they're not living in the Middle East?
Right, because it does have implications that reach far beyond just that region. We're going to break it all down for you, folks.
Okay, so first things first, the plan itself. Trump's big idea is to transform Gaza, and this is a quote, into a Riviera of the Middle East.
Quite a vision, isn't it?
That's one way to put it. He announced this back on February 4th, standing shoulder to shoulder with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The gist is that the U.S. takes the reins in Gaza, the entire Palestinian population gets relocated, and then this massive redevelopment project kicks off.
It's interesting, how this whole thing really taps into Trump's background as a real estate developer. Always thinking big, always going for those grand, attention-grabbing projects.
Speaking of attention-grabbing, did you see that AI-generated video he released on February 26th?
Oh, yeah, the one with
The golden Trump statues, the belly dancers.
and Netanyahu, shirtless Netanyahu sipping cocktails on the beach.
It's like something out of a fever dream. Totally surreal.
It definitely got people talking, and not always in a good way. Even some of Trump's most loyal supporters were calling it, well, let's just say they weren't impressed.
Yeah, I saw words like distasteful and idolatrous being thrown around. And then there's that scene with, I think it's supposed to be Elon Musk, throwing money around on the beach.
Right.
Like,
Bizarre.
so it really makes you wonder, is Trump serious about this? Or is this all just a massive publicity stunt?
Honestly, it's tough to say. I mean, this is Trump we're talking about. Grand pronouncements, that's kind of his thing. But then again, he's got this tight relationship with Netanyahu. And this whole plan could be a piece of that bigger puzzle, his approach to foreign policy.
Which, let's be honest, is anything but conventional.
Exactly.
And it's all happening against this backdrop of, well, extreme tension in Gaza. I mean, the recent conflict with Israel, the devastation, the casualties, Hamas is in control, and the ceasefire feels incredibly fragile.
Oh, incredibly fragile. And that context is so important because it raises serious questions about whether this plan could ever actually work, practically speaking. The conflict has left deep scars on both sides. There's a ton of trauma to deal with, and Gaza's struggling just to rebuild.
So this whole Riviera idea just feels completely tone deaf, right?
Yeah, to say the least. And it's definitely sparked some strong reactions, especially from the Palestinians. They see this as just another attempt to displace them, erase their presence from the region.
And they're not mincing words about it. One resident of Gaza was quoted as saying, and I'm quoting directly here, Trump can go to hell with his ideas, with his money, and with his beliefs. We are going nowhere. We are not some of his assets.
Wow.
Yeah. Pretty powerful stuff.
That really gets to the heart of it, that anger and defiance. Many Palestinians see this as a total disregard for their rights, for their deep connection to their homeland.
It's like he's treating them like pawns in some kind of real estate game.
Yeah.
Not human beings with their own history and lives.
Right. And then there's Hamas, the group that controls Gaza. They've come out swinging, calling it a crime against humanity, a threat to regional security.
So not exactly a warm welcome.
Not even close. And their reaction is particularly worrisome because it could lead to even more violence, And that's the last thing this region needs, especially if it draws in bigger players, maybe even drags the U.S. into another conflict.
This is getting complicated, fast.
Yeah.
But we've only talked about the Palestinian perspective so far. What about the rest of the world? How are other countries reacting to this whole Gaza Riviera idea?
Well, let's just say it's not getting rave reviews.
I can imagine. Uprooting millions of people from their homes probably doesn't win you any popularity contests.
You're telling me. And from a purely legal standpoint, it's extremely problematic, to put it mildly.
Really? How so?
Well, under international law, the Fourth Geneva Convention, to be specific, you can't just forcibly relocate the civilian population like that. It's a serious violation, a war crime even.
Wait, so Trump is proposing something that could put the U.S. in direct violation of international law?
It definitely is. And it's not just the legal side of things. The ethical implications are huge too, forcing people from their homes, their land, their history. That's a deeply traumatic experience, and it would have devastating consequences for the Palestinian people.
It's like he's completely overlooking the human cost, the personal stories behind all of this.
And it's not just the Palestinians who are worried. Some of the U.S.'s closest allies in the region, like Egypt and Jordan, have flat out rejected the idea of taking in millions of Palestinian refugees. King Abdullah of Jordan, he even called it a declaration of war.
Wow. Sounds like somebody skipped the diplomacy memo.
Seems that way, yeah.
Yeah.
And the international community as a whole is sounding the alarm bells, too. We've seen statements from the UN, France, Germany, the UK, all expressing serious concerns about violating international law and the dangerous precedent this would set.
So it's basically Trump against the world at this point. But what about Israel? I mean, wouldn't they be the biggest beneficiaries of this plan?
Well, it's more complicated than that. Netanyahu, yeah, he's on board, loves the idea, and some polls suggest a majority of Jewish Israelis support it. They see it as a way to finally get some security.
Which, after years of conflict, I can understand. But isn't that a bit short-sighted?
That's exactly what the opponents of the plan are saying, both inside Israel and internationally. They're arguing that true security doesn't come from force and displacement, that this would just make the situation even worse in the long run.
So, more likely to backfire than actually achieve peace.
That's the concern, yeah. And let's not forget the history here. Israel's withdrawal from Gaza back in 2005, it didn't exactly go smoothly, right? Hamas rose to power and a whole new set of problems emerged.
So basically, repeating the same mistakes and expecting a different outcome.
The definition of insanity, some might say. And even if we ignore the ethical and legal issues for a moment, just the logistics of pulling this off are mind-boggling.
Break it down for me. What would it actually take to make this happen?
Well, for starters, you have to figure out where to relocate millions of Palestinians. Trump's suggesting Egypt and Jordan, but they've already said, no way. They got their own problems to deal with, and taking on millions of refugees is just not in the cards.
So that's a major roadblock right there. And even if you could somehow convince them, the sheer scale of moving that many people...
It's astronomical. The housing, the food, healthcare, education, jobs. You'd have to create a whole new society from scratch. Yeah. And we're talking about a region that's already incredibly unstable, prone to conflict. It's a recipe for chaos.
And who's going to pay for all of this?
Well, Trump's claiming other countries will foot the bill. He's probably thinking those wealthy Gulf states, but honestly, that seems unlikely. Why would they invest billions in such a risky and controversial project?
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially with the way the global economy is looking. Everyone's tightening their belts, not looking to fund Trump's grand schemes.
Right. And then there's the political cost. This plan has already done some serious damage to America's reputation on the world stage. It's strained relationships with key allies, made the U.S. look like a bully who disregards international law and puts their own interests ahead of human rights.
So even if this plan never actually happens, the damage is already done.
You could definitely argue that. It's already created a ton of mistrust and resentment, and it's raised some serious questions about America's role in the world, their commitment to peace and stability.
It's almost like he's trying to dismantle decades of diplomacy in one fell swoop, undermine the entire international order.
It's definitely a dramatic shift in U.S. foreign policy. A lot of people are pretty unsettled by it, to say the least.
But even with all the backlash, Trump seems determined to push forward. Why? What's he trying to achieve?
Well, there are a few theories floating around. Some say it's all about appeasing his base, especially those evangelical Christians who are strongly pro-Israel.
Okay, so pandering to his supporters. What else?
Others think it's a distraction from problems here at home, or maybe even a way to boost his chances of getting reelected.
So basically, using the Middle East as a pawn in his own political games.
It's a cynical view, but it's not entirely implausible, given his past behavior. He's shown time and time again that he's willing to put his own interests above everyone else's, even on a global scale.
But what if, just for a second, we entertain the idea that he actually believes this plan will work? What would the consequences be?
Well, for the Palestinians, it would be a catastrophe. Imagine being ripped from your home, your land, your entire community, and sent to a foreign country against your will. The trauma, the resentment, the feeling of injustice, it would be immeasurable.
And wouldn't that just lead to more extremism and violence down the road?
Yeah.
It seems like the exact opposite of what you'd want if you're trying to build peace.
Exactly. And even for Israel, the long-term consequences are really unclear. They might gain control of Gaza, but at what cost? The international backlash would be intense, their relationships with their Arab neighbors would be even more strained, and they'd be left dealing with the aftermath of a massive humanitarian crisis.
Not to mention the constant threat of retaliation from displaced and angry Palestinians. It's hard to see how this would lead to anything resembling peace or stability.
Right, and then you have the wider geopolitical implications. This plan would destabilize the entire region, embolden Iran and other adversaries, and could even drag the U.S. into another costly and drawn-out conflict.
A lose-lose situation for practically everyone involved.
That's the general consensus, yeah. It really highlights the dangers of this kind of unilateral action and why diplomacy and cooperation are so important, especially when you're dealing with these complex global challenges.
Okay, so we've established that Trump's plan is, well, let's just say it's not the best idea. But what now? Is there any hope for a peaceful resolution to this conflict?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's the one that's plagued diplomats and policymakers for decades. And while things look incredibly bleak right now, history is full of surprises, right? Unexpected turns.
So you're saying there's still a glimmer of hope?
I think so. But it requires a fundamental shift in thinking, moving away from that zero-sum mentality that's dominated this conflict for so long.
Zero-sum. What do you mean by that?
The idea that one side's gain has to be the other side's loss, it's a recipe for endless conflict because it prevents compromise and cooperation.
So we need to find a way for both sides to feel like they're winning.
Not necessarily winning, but at least not losing everything. A solution where both Israelis and Palestinians can live with dignity, security, and a sense of hope for the future.
That sounds like a pretty tall order, especially with the level of mistrust and animosity that exists right now.
It is. It's a huge challenge, but it's not impossible. It requires leadership, vision, and a willingness to make tough choices.
And a willingness to look past the current stalemate and imagine a different future.
Exactly. A future where peace isn't just the absence of war, but something positive, something built on mutual respect, understanding, and cooperation.
That's a beautiful thought, but in reality, it feels like we're miles away from that kind of understanding and empathy.
You're right, it's a long road ahead. But even amidst all the negativity, there are people and organizations on both sides working tirelessly to build bridges, promote understanding, and create a more hopeful future.
It's good to remember, even in the darkest times, there's always some light.
Absolutely. And for our listeners out there, the key takeaway is to stay engaged, stay informed, and don't let the complexity of this issue stop you from caring and seeking out solutions.
Don't just accept the headlines or the oversimplified narratives. Dig deeper, challenge your own assumptions, and be a voice for peace and understanding, no matter how small it might seem.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Remember, even the most deeply rooted conflicts can be transformed if there's enough willpower, creativity, and belief in a better future.
And that brings us to another critical question. If Trump's plan is off the table, what are the alternatives? Are there any realistic options that could actually lead to lasting peace?
That's a topic that deserves its own deep dive, and that's exactly where we're heading next. We'll explore the various proposals that have been put forward over the years, the challenges they face, and the potential they hold for a more peaceful future.
Sounds good to me. Stay with us, folks. We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
We'll be diving right back in. Don't go anywhere.
And we're back, still wading through the fallout of this whole Gaza proposal. Before we went to those totally imaginary sponsors, we were talking about all the pushback this plan is facing.
Yeah, it's really like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Just doesn't work.
And yet, some Jewish Israelis seem to see it as a possible answer. Like, this could be the path to finally getting some peace and security.
It makes sense in a way, right? After all these years of conflict, the fear of rocket attacks, people want solutions.
Oh, absolutely, I get that. But it still feels like a Band-Aid solution, doesn't it? Like addressing the symptom and not the underlying problem.
That's a good point. And that's exactly what a lot of the people who oppose the plan are saying, both within Israel and on the global stage. Their argument is that real security can't be achieved by force and displacement. They say it'll just create more problems in the long run.
So, more likely to blow up in everyone's faces than actually bring peace.
That's the worry, yeah. And we've got to remember that history tends to repeat itself. Remember Israel's withdrawal from Gaza back in 2005? Didn't exactly go smoothly, did it?
Nope. It just paved the way for Hamas to take control.
And created a whole bunch of new problems, as we all know.
It's like they're making the same mistake twice, hoping for a different result.
Well, as they say, the definition of insanity is
Doing the same thing over and over.
and expecting different results. And even if we completely ignore the ethical and legal minefield this plan creates, just the practical stuff, the logistics, they're incredibly difficult to imagine actually working.
Yeah, break it down for me. How would this even play out?
Okay, so first, you've got to figure out where to put millions of Palestinians. Trump's suggesting Egypt and Jordan, right?
Right.
But they've already said absolutely not. They're dealing with their own economic and political struggles. They don't want to be suddenly responsible for millions of refugees.
Right, so that's a non-starter.
Yeah.
And even if you could somehow magically convince them, just the practical stuff, moving that many people.
It would be insane. Housing, food, healthcare, schools, jobs.
Yeah.
You're basically talking about building an entire new society from scratch, and all of that in a region that's, well, let's be honest, already on a knife's edge.
It's practically guaranteed to be a complete disaster.
Pretty much. And then the elephant in the room, money. Who's going to pay for all of this?
Exactly.
Trump's saying other countries, probably those rich Gulf states will pick up the tab, but come on, does that really seem likely?
Not really. Not with the state of the global economy.
Nobody's exactly flush with cash these days. They're not going to be lining up to bankroll this kind of risky, controversial project.
And what about the political costs? I mean, this plan's already kind of trashed America's reputation on the world stage, right?
Oh, yeah. Big time. It's really strained relationships with some key allies, made the U.S. look like a bully who just ignores international law and only cares about their own interests.
It's like a giant PR nightmare. So even if this whole plan just fades away and never happens, the damage is already done.
Yeah, for sure. It's sown a lot of mistrust, and it raises big questions about America's role in the world, their commitment to peace and stability, all that.
It's like he's trying to single-handedly dismantle decades of diplomacy,
Yeah.
undermine the entire international order.
It's a major shift in U.S. foreign policy, that's for sure. And a lot of people, a lot of people are not happy about it at all.
But Trump seems determined to push forward anyway. All the backlash, all the obstacles, why?
Yeah.
What's his goal here?
Tough to say for sure. But there are a few ideas out there. Some folks think it's all about keeping his supporters happy, especially those evangelical Christians. They're pretty pro-Israel.
So, playing to his base. Got it. What else?
Others say it's a way to distract from domestic problems. Things aren't exactly peachy keen here at home. Or maybe it's a way to boost his chances of getting reelected. Who knows?
So, using the Middle East as a pawn in his own little political game.
It's definitely a cynical take, but it's not totally out of character for him, right? I mean, we've seen him prioritize his own interests over pretty much everyone else's before, even on the world stage.
That's for sure. But let's play devil's advocate for a second. Let's say he actually thinks this plan will work. What would that even look like? What would the consequences be?
Well, for the Palestinians, it would be absolutely devastating. Imagine being forcibly removed from your home, your land, everything you know, and shipped off to some foreign country. The trauma, the anger, the feeling of injustice, it would be overwhelming.
And wouldn't that just fuel more extremism? More violence down the road? It seems like the opposite of what you'd want if you were trying to build lasting peace.
Exactly. And even for Israel, the long-term consequences are, well, nobody really knows. They might gain control of Gaza, but at a huge cost. The international community would be furious. Their relationships with their Arab neighbors would be even more strained, and they'd be stuck dealing with a massive humanitarian crisis.
Not to mention the constant threat of retaliation from all those displaced Palestinians. It's just hard to see how this would lead to anything good for anyone.
Yeah, and then there's the whole geopolitical side of things. This plan would throw the entire region into even more chaos, empower Iran and other adversaries, and could even drag the U.S. into another long and expensive war.
So basically a lose-lose situation all around.
Pretty much, yeah. It really highlights the dangers of going it alone, It shows why diplomacy and working together are so important when you're dealing with these complicated global issues.
Okay, so we've talked about why this plan is a bad idea. But what's next? Is there any hope for a peaceful solution to this whole mess?
That's the question that's been haunting everyone for decades, right? And things might look pretty grim right now, but you never know what the future holds. History is full of twists and turns.
So you're saying there's still a chance?
I think so. But it would need a major change in thinking, a move away from this us versus them mentality.
That's been a major roadblock for sure.
It has. It's this idea that one side has to win and the other has to lose. That kind of thinking just breeds conflict because it makes compromise and cooperation impossible.
So we need to figure out a way for both sides to feel like they're coming out ahead.
Not necessarily coming out ahead, but at least not losing everything.
Oh.
We need a solution where both Israelis and Palestinians can live with dignity, safety, and a sense of hope.
That sounds really nice, but is it even possible with all the baggage, all the mistrust between the two sides?
It's a long shot, I'll admit that, but it's not impossible. It would take strong leadership, vision, and a willingness to make tough choices.
And a willingness to look beyond the current situation and imagine something different.
Right, exactly. A future where peace isn't just the absence of war, but something real, something built on respect, understanding, and cooperation.
That's a great vision, but realistically.
It's a long road, yeah. But even with all the negativity out there are people on both sides working hard to find common ground, build bridges, create a more hopeful future. There are glimmers of hope out there.
It's good to remember that, especially when things seem so dark.
It is. And for anyone listening, the takeaway is to stay engaged, stay informed. Don't let the complexity of this whole thing make you give up on finding solutions.
Don't just accept the headlines at face value.
Yeah.
Look deeper, challenge your own assumptions, and be a voice for peace. Even if it feels like a small voice, it matters.
That's right. Even the most entrenched conflicts can change if people are willing to work for it, get creative, and believe in a better future.
Well said. And that brings us to another big question. What are the alternatives to this plan? What other options are out there that could actually lead to a lasting peace?
That's a topic that deserves its own deep dive, and that's exactly where we'll be heading next. We'll look at the different ideas that have been proposed, the challenges they face, and whether any of them hold the potential for real, lasting peace.
Sounds good to me. Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So we spent a lot of time talking about Trump's plan, why it's so controversial, why it probably wouldn't work. But let's step back for a second. Zoom out a bit. What are the big issues at the heart of this conflict, this seemingly endless conflict?
Well, at the very core, it's about land, identity, security. Both Israelis and Palestinians feel this incredibly deep connection to the same piece of land, and both have legitimate grievances, things that have been building up for generations.
It's almost like a love story gone wrong.
Yeah.
Two people who are both convinced they're the rightful owner of the same heart.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. And like any long-running feud, the narratives on both sides have gotten so intertwined with trauma, displacement, violence. It makes it incredibly hard to even find common ground.
We've talked a lot about the Palestinian side of things, the displacement during the Nakba, their struggle for self-determination, but we haven't really dug into the Israeli perspective as much. What are their main concerns?
Well, for Israelis, security is absolutely paramount. I mean, since the very founding of Israel back in 1948, they've faced multiple wars, terrorist attacks. It's this constant sense of threat, this feeling that their very existence is at stake. So they feel this need to defend their borders, protect their citizens at all costs.
And they often point to the fact that they've tried to make concessions in the past, land for peace deals, but those haven't exactly worked out so well.
Right, and that feeds into this feeling that they're under siege, misunderstood by the rest of the world, that nobody really takes their security concerns seriously.
So you've got these two very deeply rooted narratives, both fueled by fear, trauma, this sense of historical injustice. No wonder it's so hard to find a way forward.
Yeah, it's a classic case of hurting people hurt people, Both sides are acting out of pain and fear, and it just perpetuates this cycle of violence that seems impossible to break.
So what do we do? If Trump's plan is a no-go, what are the other options? Is there any realistic path towards a peaceful solution?
Well, the two-state solution, while it's definitely facing some serious challenges, is still seen by many experts and international mediators as the most viable option.
You mean Israel and Palestine as two separate, independent countries living side by side?
Exactly. But it would take enormous compromises from both sides. They'd have to agree on borders, security arrangements, the status of Jerusalem, what to do about Palestinian refugees.
That's a lot to figure out.
It is. It's a huge undertaking. And it's only gotten more complicated over time with the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and the internal political divisions among Palestinians. But the alternative, a single state where one group dominates the other, that's likely to lead to even more conflict, more instability.
So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Pretty much, yeah. But there are other ideas out there, things that might be worth exploring. Some have proposed a confederation, where Israel and Palestine share some aspects of government but keep their separate identities.
So like a power-sharing arrangement.
Yeah, exactly. And others think we need to take a more regional approach, get other Arab countries involved in fostering economic cooperation and security.
Thinking outside the box, basically.
Right. I think the key here is to keep talking, keep the dialogue open, be willing to try new things, and remember that any lasting peace has to involve compromise. Both sides need to be willing to see the other's humanity, their legitimate concerns.
That sounds amazing, but it feels like we're so far away from that kind of understanding.
I hear you. It's a long, long road. But even in the midst of all this negativity, all this cynicism, there are people on both sides, individuals, organizations, working to build bridges, promote understanding, create a better future.
That's a good thought to hold on to, right?
Yeah,
Even when things feel hopeless, there are still people out there working for change.
absolutely. And for our listeners, I think the takeaway is stay engaged, stay informed. Don't let the complexity of this issue make you turn away.
Don't just take the headlines at face value. Do your own research, challenge your own assumptions, and speak up for peace. Even if you think your voice is small, it matters.
It does. Even the most intractable conflicts can be transformed if there are enough people willing to put in the work, get creative, and believe in a better future.
Well, that about wraps it up for this deep dive. We've covered a lot, from Trump's plan to the historical roots of this conflict to the search for a lasting peace. It's a complicated issue, and there are no easy answers.
That's for sure. But hopefully you've gained some new insights, learned some things you didn't know before, and maybe even feel a little more hopeful about the future.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll be back again soon with another deep dive into a fascinating and timely topic. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and most importantly, keep those conversations going.